When I turned 71, I had millions in the bank. That's when my only son died in a car accident. I lost my entire world. At the funeral, triplets approached me, revealing a secret that would change my life forever. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. My name is Marlene, and at 71 years old, I thought I understood loss. I was wrong. The call came on a Tuesday morning in March. I was sitting in my kitchen, the same kitchen where I'd made Michael his breakfast every morning until he moved out at 25. The same kitchen where we'd shared countless conversations about his dreams, his medical practice, his plans for the future. The phone rang, and something in my chest tightened before I even answered. Mrs. Patterson? This is Officer Williams from the state police. I'm calling about your son, Michael Patterson. The world stopped. Everything after that became a blur of medical terms I didn't want to understand. Collision. Unresponsive. I'm sorry for your loss. The officer's voice was kind but distant, like he'd made this call 100 times before. Michael was gone. My only child, my brilliant son who'd become a respected doctor, who called me every Sunday without fail, who still sent me flowers on Mother's Day with notes written in his careful handwriting, gone at 43, in an instant, because someone ran a red light. I hung up the phone and stared at my hands. They looked older suddenly, more fragile than I'd noticed before. The silence in my house felt different too, not peaceful, but empty, hollow in a way that made my chest ache. People always said I was lucky to have so much money. My late husband Gerald had been smart with investments, and I'd been careful with our savings after he passed 8 years ago. We had millions in the bank, a beautiful house, everything we'd worked for our entire lives. But what good is money when the only person you want to share it with is gone? The funeral preparations passed in a haze. Michael's colleagues from the hospital helped arrange everything. They spoke about him with such respect, calling him dedicated and compassionate. They talked about the long hours he worked, the patients he cared for, how he never seemed to take time for himself. He was always helping someone, Dr. Rodriguez told me at the visitation, always staying late, always going above and beyond. We used to joke that the hospital was his second home. I nodded and smiled, accepting their condolences, but inside I felt guilty. Had Michael been working so much because he was lonely? Had I failed him somehow as a mother? We spoke every week, but now I wondered if that was enough. Should I have visited more? Should I have insisted he take vacations, find someone to settle down with? The funeral service was held at St. Mary's, the same church where Michael had been baptized. The pews were filled with people whose lives he'd touched, colleagues, patients, neighbors. I sat in the front row, wearing the black dress I'd bought for Gerald's funeral, hoping I'd never have to wear it again. Father Martinez spoke beautifully about Michael's dedication to healing others, about how he embodied the best qualities of both medicine and faith. I tried to focus on his words, on the hymns, on anything that might bring me comfort. But all I could think about was how quiet my house would be when I went home. After the service, we made our way to Greenwood Cemetery. The April air was crisp, with a hint of spring that Michael would never see. I walked slowly behind the casket, supported by my neighbor Mrs. Chen, who'd insisted on staying by my side throughout the day. At the graveside, I listened as Father Martinez said the final prayers. I watched as they lowered my son's casket into the earth, and I felt something inside me break that I knew would never heal completely. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. Parents aren't supposed to bury their children. As the crowd began to disperse, people approached me with final words of sympathy. I shook hands, accepted hugs, thanked everyone for coming. Most of the attendees had already left when I noticed 3 small figures standing at a distance, near a large oak tree. 3 identical little girls, maybe 10 or 11 years old, all wearing black dresses that looked too formal for children their age. They stood close together, holding hands, their faces serious in a way that seemed beyond their years. What struck me most was how they were looking at Michael's grave, not with the curiosity of children, but with genuine grief. I watched as they approached the fresh mound of earth slowly, almost reverently. Each girl carried a single white flower, daisies, I think. They placed them carefully on the grave, one by one. The similarity between them was startling. They were clearly triplets, with the same dark hair, the same serious brown eyes, the same delicate features. As they stood there in silence, I heard one of them speak in a voice so soft, I almost missed it. "Bye, Daddy." The words hit me like a physical blow. I must have made a sound because all three girls turned to look at me. Their faces showed surprise, then something that looked almost like fear. Without saying another word, they turned and ran toward the parking lot, their small hands still clasped together. I stood frozen, watching them disappear behind the cars. Had I imagined it? Had one of those children really called Michael Daddy? But that was impossible. Michael didn't have children. He'd never even been married. He would have told me. Wouldn't he? Mrs. Chen tugged gently at my arm. "Marlene, dear, we should get you home. You've had such a long day." I nodded, but kept looking toward where the girls had vanished. "Did you see those children?" I asked her. "What children, honey?" "The three little girls. They were right here a moment ago." Mrs. Chen looked around the now empty cemetery with concern. "I don't see anyone, dear. It's just us now." Maybe the grief was playing tricks on my mind. Maybe I'd imagined the whole thing. But as we walked back to the car, I couldn't shake the image of those three identical faces, or the sound of that small voice saying, "Bye, Daddy." That night, I sat alone in my living room, surrounded by sympathy flowers and casserole dishes from neighbors. The house felt impossibly quiet. I kept replaying the day, the service, the people who'd shared their memories of Michael. But my mind kept returning to those three little girls. If Michael had children, wouldn't I know? Wouldn't he have brought them to visit? Introduced them to their grandmother? The idea was absurd, and yet. I thought about all those late nights Michael worked, all those conferences he attended, all those times he'd seemed distracted during our phone calls. Had there been something he wasn't telling me? Some part of his life he'd kept hidden? The rational part of my mind insisted I was looking for mysteries where none existed. Grief could make you see things, imagine connections that weren't there. Those children probably weren't even at the funeral for Michael. Maybe they were visiting another grave nearby. But even as I tried to convince myself, I couldn't forget the way they'd looked at his grave. The careful way they'd placed those flowers, and that voice, so small and sad, saying goodbye to someone they clearly loved. As I turned off the lights and headed upstairs to bed, I made a decision. Tomorrow, I would go back to the cemetery. I needed to understand what I'd seen, even if it meant discovering that my grief had made me imagine things that weren't real. Because if those children were somehow connected to Michael, if my son had secrets I never knew about, then maybe, just maybe, I wasn't as alone in this world as I thought. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those three little faces, heard that whispered, "Bye, Daddy." By dawn, I'd convinced myself I was losing my mind. Grief could do that to people, couldn't it? Make them see things, hear things that weren't really there. But I couldn't stay away from the cemetery. I started going every morning, just after breakfast. At first, I told myself I was visiting Michael, bringing fresh flowers, talking to him the way some people do at graves. But the truth was, I was looking for those children. For a week, I saw nothing but groundskeepers and the occasional elderly visitor. I began to think I really had imagined the whole thing. Maybe Mrs. Chen was right. Maybe the stress and sorrow had played tricks on my mind. Then, on the following Wednesday, I saw them again. It was around 10 in the morning, and I was kneeling beside Michael's grave, arranging the yellow tulips I'd brought. Yellow had always been his favorite color. As I stood up, brushing dirt from my knees, I caught a glimpse of movement near the same oak tree where I'd first spotted them. Three small figures in school uniforms, navy blue skirts, white shirts, matching cardigans. They were walking slowly toward Michael's grave, just like before, each carrying a single flower. This time I could see them more clearly in the morning light. They were definitely identical triplets, around 10 years old, with dark brown hair pulled back in neat ponytails. Their faces were serious, almost solemn, as they approached the grave. They moved with a careful dignity that seemed unusual for children their age. I stayed very still, afraid that any movement might frighten them away again. I watched as they placed their flowers, red carnations this time, on the fresh earth. Each girl stood quietly for a moment, as if saying a private prayer. Then the girl in the middle spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "We miss you, Daddy. Aunt Margaret says you're in heaven now." My heart stopped. There it was again. Daddy. This wasn't my imagination. I must have shifted or made some small sound, because all three girls suddenly looked up and saw me. Their eyes widened with surprise, and for a moment we all froze, staring at each other across the grave of my son. The girl who had spoken took a small step forward. She had the most serious expression of the three, and something in her posture suggested she was the leader. Are you Daddy's mommy?" she asked hesitantly. I couldn't speak. I just nodded, my throat too tight for words. The three girls exchanged glances, some silent communication passing between them. Then the same girl spoke again. "I'm Faith," she said, her voice polite but cautious. "These are my sisters, Hope and Joy. We were Daddy's daughters, Hope and Joy." The names hit me like a revelation. I looked more closely at each girl, trying to see Michael in their faces. Now that I was looking for it, I could see the resemblance, the shape of their eyes, the way they tilted their heads when they were thinking, just like Michael used to do. "How old are you?" I managed to ask. 10, Faith answered for all three. "We'll be 11 in September. 10 years old." Michael would have been 33 when they were born. I tried to think back to that time, to remember if there had been any signs, any changes in his behavior, but everything seemed so normal in my memory. Where do you live?" I asked gently. The girls exchanged another look, this one more worried. "With Aunt Margaret," Faith said finally. "She takes care of us now." "And where is Aunt Margaret today?" "She's at work. She cleans offices downtown. We're supposed to be at school, but..." Hope's voice trailed off. "But we wanted to visit Daddy," Joy finished quietly. She was the first time I'd heard her speak, and her voice was softer than her sister's, almost musical. I looked at these three beautiful children, my son's daughters, apparently, and felt a mixture of emotions I couldn't even name. Joy, confusion, anger that I'd never known about them. Heartbreak that Michael was gone before I could meet them properly. "Does Aunt Margaret know you're here?" I asked. Faith shook her head. "She said we shouldn't come anymore. She said it was too sad. But we had to say goodbye," Hope added. "We didn't get to before he went to heaven." I knelt down so I could be at their eye level. "What do you mean you didn't get to say goodbye? Daddy was supposed to come see us that weekend," Joy explained, her eyes filling with tears. "But then Aunt Margaret got a phone call, and she started crying, and she told us Daddy had an accident. The weekend of the accident, Michael had canceled our usual Sunday dinner that week, saying he had something important to do, something that couldn't wait." "Did you see your daddy often?" I asked carefully. "Every other weekend," Faith said. "And sometimes he would take us to the park after school. He taught us how to ride bikes and how to make pancakes. He read us stories too," Hope added. "Really good ones about princesses and dragons. And he always brought us presents," Joy said with a small smile. "Nothing fancy, just little things, coloring books and hair ribbons, and once a puzzle with 100 pieces." I felt tears starting to form. These children clearly loved Michael, and he had been a part of their lives in ways I'd never known about. How had he managed to keep this secret for 10 years? "Why didn't he ever bring you to meet me?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. The girls looked at each other uncertainly. "He said," Faith began slowly, "he said you were still very sad about Grandpa Gerald dying, and he didn't want to make you sadder." That didn't make sense. Gerald had died 8 years ago, and while I'd grieved, I'd never been the type to shut myself away from life. Michael knew that. "Did he say anything else about me?" I pressed gently. "He said you were the best mommy in the world," Hope said earnestly, "and that someday, when the time was right, we would meet you, and you would love us too." The tears came then, impossible to stop. My son had children, 3 beautiful daughters, and he'd kept them from me for reasons I couldn't understand. And now he was gone, and these little girls were as lost as I was. "I would have loved you," I whispered. "I would have loved you so much." Faith stepped closer and, to my surprise, reached out to pat my hand awkwardly. It's okay, she said in that serious way of hers. Daddy said sometimes grown-ups have to make hard choices to protect the people they love. Before I could ask what she meant by that, I heard a woman's voice calling from across the cemetery. Faith, hope, joy, what are you doing here? A woman in her 50s was hurrying toward us, her face a mixture of panic and anger. She was thin, with graying hair pulled back in a practical bun, wearing the kind of sturdy clothes that suggested a life of hard work. The three girls immediately moved closer together, a defensive gesture that broke my heart. I'm sorry, Aunt Margaret, Faith said quickly. We just wanted to visit Daddy one more time. The woman, Aunt Margaret apparently, reached us and immediately began checking the girls over as if she expected to find them injured. You can't just leave school like that, she scolded. What if something had happened to you? What if you'd gotten lost? Then she seemed to notice me for the first time. Her expression became wary, almost fearful. Who are you? She asked bluntly. I stood up slowly, wiping my eyes. I'm Marlene Patterson, Michael's mother. The color drained from Margaret's face. She looked from me to the girls and back again, and I could see her mind working, trying to figure out how much I knew. Come on, girls, she said quickly, reaching for Faith's hand. We need to get you back to school. Wait, I said, stepping forward. Please, I just found out about them. I need to understand. No, Margaret said firmly, pulling the girls closer to her. I'm sorry for your loss, Mrs. Patterson, I truly am. Michael was a good man. But these children have been through enough. I'm their grandmother, I said, my voice stronger than I felt. Surely I have a right. You have no rights here, Margaret interrupted, her voice sharp with protectiveness. Michael made his choices for good reasons. Don't make this harder than it already is. She began walking away quickly, the three girls following reluctantly. But Faith turned back to look at me, her young face full of confusion and sadness. Will we see you again? She called out. Before I could answer, Margaret had hurried them into an old blue sedan and driven away, leaving me standing alone beside my son's grave with more questions than ever. That night, I sat in my kitchen with a cup of tea I couldn't drink, trying to make sense of what I'd learned. Michael had 3 daughters, 3 10-year-old girls who called him Daddy and visited his grave with flowers. They lived with someone named Aunt Margaret, who seemed terrified of me finding out about them. And Michael had told them I was still grieving Gerald, that he was protecting me from something that would make me sadder. None of it made sense. What could be sad about having grandchildren? What could be so terrible that Michael felt he had to keep his own daughter's secret from me for their entire lives? I thought about Faith's words. Daddy said sometimes grown-ups have to make hard choices to protect the people they love. What had Michael been protecting me from? And more importantly, what was I going to do now that I knew these children existed? One thing was certain. I couldn't just pretend I'd never seen them. They were Michael's daughters, which made them my granddaughters. They were the only family I had left in the world. Somehow, I was going to find out the truth, and somehow, I was going to find a way to be part of their lives, whether Aunt Margaret liked it or not. I couldn't let it go. For 3 days after meeting the girls, I found myself driving through neighborhoods, looking for that old blue sedan. I knew it was probably futile. The city was huge, and I had no idea where they lived. But I couldn't sit still, couldn't just accept that my granddaughters were out there somewhere while I knew nothing about their lives. On Saturday morning, I decided to try a different approach. I drove to Michael's apartment building, thinking maybe someone there might know something about the girls. The building manager, Mr. Torres, had been helpful with clearing out Michael's belongings after the funeral. Mrs. Patterson, he said when he saw me in the lobby, how are you holding up? I'm managing, I said, though that wasn't entirely true. Mr. Torres, I need to ask you something. Did Michael ever have visitors? Children, perhaps? His expression became cautious. Well, I wouldn't normally discuss tenants' private affairs. Please, I said. It's important. I think they might be family. He glanced around the empty lobby, then lowered his voice. There were 3 little girls who came by sometimes. Always very polite, very quiet. They usually came with an older woman. Not young, maybe 50s. My heart raced. How often did they visit? Every couple of weeks, I'd say. Dr. Patterson would pick them up sometimes or they'd come here. Never caused any trouble. Sweet kids. Do you know anything about the woman with them? Mr. Torres shook his head. She kept to herself, but she always looked tired, if you know what I mean. Like she was carrying a heavy load. That description matched the woman who'd called herself Aunt Margaret. I thanked Mr. Torres and left, feeling like I was slowly collecting pieces of a puzzle I didn't yet understand. That afternoon, I made a decision that probably wasn't entirely rational. I drove back to the cemetery and waited. If the girls had been skipping school to visit Michael before, maybe they would do it again. I parked under some trees where I could see Michael's grave without being too obvious about it. I felt a bit like a stalker, but I pushed that thought away. These were my granddaughters. I had a right to know about them. I waited for 2 hours before I saw the blue sedan pull up near the cemetery entrance. My heart jumped as I watched Margaret get out, followed by the 3 girls. This time they weren't in school uniforms. They wore simple weekend clothes, jeans and sweaters that looked well cared for but not expensive. I waited until they'd been at the grave for a few minutes before I approached slowly, not wanting to startle them. Margaret saw me first, and her face immediately tensed. "Mrs. Patterson," she said, stepping protectively in front of the girls. "What are you doing here?" "The same thing you are," I said gently. "Visiting my son." Faith, hope, and joy peered around Margaret, their faces curious but wary. I could see the family resemblance more clearly now. They had Michael's eyes, definitely, and something about their expressions reminded me of him at that age. "We brought Daddy new flowers," Joy said softly, holding up a small bouquet of mixed wildflowers. "We picked them ourselves." "They're beautiful," I said, meaning it. "I'm sure he would love them." Margaret remained tense, ready to leave at any moment, but I could see something in her expression. Exhaustion, maybe, or resignation. She looked like a woman who was trying to hold too many things together at once. "Margaret," I said carefully, "could we talk? Just for a few minutes?" "There's nothing to talk about," she replied, but her voice lacked conviction. "Please, I just want to understand. These are Michael's daughters, which makes them my granddaughters. I'm not trying to cause trouble. I just want to know about them." The girls were listening to every word, their young faces serious. Faith stepped forward slightly. "Aunt Margaret," she said quietly, "maybe we should talk to her. Daddy always said she was nice." Margaret looked down at Faith, and I saw her resolve wavering. She was quiet for a long moment, then sighed deeply. "Not here," she said finally. "There's a diner on Maple Street, O'Malley's. Do you know it?" I nodded. "I can meet you there." "Give us 10 minutes, Margaret said. "And Mrs. Patterson, this doesn't mean anything's changed. I'm just willing to answer a few questions." 20 minutes later, I found myself sitting in a worn vinyl booth across from Margaret while Faith, Hope, and Joy shared a plate of French fries and chocolate milkshakes. The diner was nearly empty on a Saturday afternoon, which gave us privacy to talk. "How long have you been taking care of them?" I asked quietly. Margaret stirred her coffee absently. "Since their mother died. Almost 4 years now." 4 years? I was shocked. "Their mother died when they were only 6? Margaret nodded. "Sarah was my sister. She had some problems. Health problems, mainly. Michael helped her as much as he could. But when she passed, there was nobody else." I looked at the 3 girls, who were giggling quietly over something Joy had whispered. They seemed happy enough, but I could see a kind of carefulness in the way they acted, as if they were used to not drawing too much attention to themselves. "What kind of health problems?" I asked. Margaret's expression became guarded again. "That's not really." "Look, Mrs. Patterson, I understand you want to know about them, but some things are private. I'm their grandmother," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "If there are health issues I should know about, you're not their grandmother," Margaret interrupted sharply. "Not legally, not in any way that matters. Michael never married Sarah. He helped support them, yes, and he loved those girls more than anything, but you have no legal claim to them." The words stung, but I could see the fear behind Margaret's harsh tone. She was protecting the girls the only way she knew how. "I'm not trying to take them away from you. I said softly. I can see that you love them. But Margaret, I'm 71 years old. Michael was my only child. These girls are the only family I have left. Margaret looked at me for a long moment, and I saw something shift in her expression. Maybe she recognized the loneliness in my voice, or maybe she was just tired of carrying all the responsibility alone. Sarah had a genetic condition, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, something that affects the muscles, makes them weak over time. It's rare, and it's hereditary. My stomach dropped. I looked at the three girls, studying their faces, their movements. They seemed healthy enough, but I realized I didn't know what to look for. Do the girls have it too? I asked. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. Two of them do. Hope and Joy. Faith seems to be clear, but we won't know for sure until they're older. I felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. My granddaughters, two of them, had inherited a genetic condition that would make their muscles weak over time. How bad is it? I whispered. It's manageable, with the right care, physical therapy, medications, monitoring, but it's expensive, really expensive. Michael was helping with the medical costs, but now she didn't need to finish. Now Michael was gone, and she was trying to manage everything on her own. I looked at Hope and Joy again, seeing them with new eyes. They did seem a bit more careful in their movements than Faith, and now that I was looking for it, I could see that they tired more easily. Joy was leaning against the booth as if sitting upright was taking effort. Is that why Michael kept them secret from me? I asked. Because of their condition? Margaret nodded slowly. He said you'd already been through enough sadness in your life. He didn't want you to have to worry about sick grandchildren on top of everything else, he thought. He thought it would be too much for you. I felt a flash of anger at my son, even in death. Too much for me? Did he really think I was so fragile that I couldn't handle loving children who needed extra care? But then I looked at Margaret's exhausted face, at the careful way the girls moved, at the weight of responsibility that was clearly crushing this woman who was trying so hard to do right by them, and I began to understand. Michael hadn't been protecting me from sadness. He'd been protecting me from heartbreak, and maybe protecting the girls from having to deal with another adult who might not be able to handle their condition. What kind of care do they need? I asked. Margaret looked surprised by the question. Physical therapy twice a week, regular checkups with specialists, medications to slow the progression. It's not just the money, though, that's a big part of it. It's the time, the coordination, making sure they don't overexert themselves but still get enough activity to maintain their strength. And you've been managing all of this alone? I work nights cleaning office buildings, Margaret said quietly. It gives me flexibility to take them to appointments during the day. But it's hard. They're good girls, they don't complain, but I worry about them constantly. I watched Faith carefully cut Joy's food into smaller pieces, watched Hope automatically hand Joy her napkin when she needed it. These children had learned to take care of each other in ways that broke my heart. Margaret, I said slowly, what if you didn't have to do this alone anymore? She looked at me suspiciously. What do you mean? I mean, what if there was someone who could help with the medical costs? Someone who could drive them to appointments, hire the best specialists, make sure they have everything they need? Mrs. Patterson, Margaret said carefully, if you're talking about money, I'm talking about family, I interrupted. I'm talking about these girls having a grandmother who loves them and wants to be part of their lives. I'm talking about you having support instead of carrying this burden alone. Margaret stared at me for a long moment. Then she glanced at the girls, who were pretending not to listen, but obviously hanging on every word. It's not that simple, she said finally. Maybe it could be, I said. Maybe we could find a way to make it work. Just then, Faith slid out of her side of the booth and came around to stand next to me. She looked up at me with those serious brown eyes that reminded me so much of Michael. Are you really our grandma? She asked quietly. I felt my throat tighten. Yes, sweetheart, I really am. And you want to know us? Even though Hope and Joy are sick? The question was so direct, so matter-of-fact, that it took my breath away. This 10-year-old child was asking me the same question Michael had apparently struggled with for years. Especially because they're sick, I said, reaching out to touch her hand gently. That's what families do. We take care of each other. Faith studied my face for a moment, then nodded as if she'd made some important decision. "I think Daddy would like that," she said simply. From across the table, I heard Margaret let out a shaky breath. When I looked at her, I saw tears in her eyes. "This is all happening very fast," she said. "It doesn't have to," I assured her. "We can take our time, figure things out step by step. But Margaret, please don't shut me out. These girls are all the family I have left." She was quiet for a long time, absently turning her coffee cup in her hands. Finally, she looked up at me. "They'll need to get to know you first, and you'll need to understand what you're getting into. This isn't just about having grandchildren to spoil. This is about medical appointments and insurance battles and watching children you love deal with something that's going to affect them for the rest of their lives." "I understand," I said, though I knew I probably didn't. Not really. "And if you change your mind, if it becomes too much, you can't just walk away. These girls have lost enough people already." I looked at Faith, who was still standing beside me, and at Hope and Joy, who were watching our conversation with the kind of serious attention that suggested they'd learned to pay close attention to adult conversations about their future. "I won't walk away," I said firmly. "These are my granddaughters, Michael's daughters. Nothing about their condition changes that." Margaret nodded slowly, as if she was making a decision that scared her. "Okay," she said finally. "We can try, but we do this my way, at my pace. And the girls' needs come first. Always, always," I agreed. For the first time since Michael's death, I felt something that might have been hope stirring in my chest. I had granddaughters, 3 beautiful, brave little girls who needed love and care and someone to fight for them. And maybe, just maybe, they needed me as much as I needed them. The first visit was scheduled for the following Saturday. Margaret insisted it be at their house, on their territory, which I understood completely. I was nervous as I drove through the modest neighborhood, checking house numbers until I found theirs. A small, well-maintained bungalow with a tiny front garden full of spring flowers. Margaret answered the door before I could even knock. She looked as nervous as I felt, but she stepped aside to let me in. "Girls," she called, "Mrs. Patterson is here." The house was small but spotlessly clean, filled with the kind of furniture that was clearly secondhand but cared for. Children's artwork covered the refrigerator, and I could see school backpacks lined up neatly by the front door. It felt like a real home, lived in and loved. Faith appeared first, as I was beginning to understand she usually did. She was followed by Hope and Joy, who hung back slightly, suddenly shy. "Hello," I said, feeling awkward. "What was the protocol for meeting granddaughters you never knew existed?" "Hi, Grandma Marlene," Faith said, and the title made my heart skip. We'd agreed on it during our phone conversation earlier that week. The girls had suggested it themselves. "We made cookies," Joy announced, stepping forward with a plate. "Chocolate chip," Aunt Margaret helped. "They're beautiful," I said, accepting one. They were slightly lopsided and probably had too many chocolate chips, but they tasted wonderful. Margaret gestured toward the living room. "Would you like to sit down? The girls wanted to show you some things." We settled on the couch, and I found myself with Faith on one side and Hope on the other, while Joy curled up in the armchair across from us. Margaret remained standing, watching carefully. "We made you a book," Hope said, pulling out a construction paper creation held together with yarn. "It's about our family." I opened it carefully. The first page had a drawing of a man labeled Daddy in crayon letters. He was tall and stick-thin, with brown hair and a huge smile. The next page showed 3 little girls holding hands, with their names written above each figure. "This is us when we were 7, Faith explained, pointing to the drawing. "That's when we all learned to ride bikes. Daddy taught us in the park." As we turned the pages, I saw their life unfold in crayon and marker drawings. There was Mommy, a woman with long dark hair who appeared in the early pages but disappeared after a certain point. There was Aunt Margaret in her work clothes, always with arms stretched wide as if hugging someone. And there was Michael, present in almost every picture, teaching them to cook, reading them stories, pushing them on swings. "Daddy said you lived far away," Joy said as I studied a drawing of Michael and the 3 girls around a birthday cake, "but that someday we might meet you." "I didn't live far away," I said gently. "I just didn't know about you. But I wish I had. I would have loved to be part of all these wonderful times." Hope leaned against my arm as we continued through the book. She was smaller than her sisters, I noticed, and seemed to tire more easily. Even sitting still, she rested against me as if being upright took effort. "Are you really rich?" Faith asked suddenly, with the directness that only children possess. "Faith!" Margaret scolded, but I held up a hand. "It's okay. Yes, I suppose I am. Your grandfather and I were very careful with money, and when he died, he left me well provided for. Daddy said rich people sometimes don't like poor people," Joy said matter-of-factly, "but he said you weren't like that." "Your daddy was right," I said, though I wondered what experiences had led Michael to have that conversation with them. Having money doesn't make someone better or worse than anyone else. It just means they have different responsibilities. "What kind of responsibilities?" Hope asked sleepily. I thought about how to explain it to a 10-year-old. "Well, if you have more than you need, I think you should help people who don't have enough, like how you three take care of each other." Faith nodded seriously. "That makes sense." We spent the next hour looking through photo albums that Margaret brought out. There were pictures of the girls at various ages, always together, often with Michael. I saw him teaching them to garden, taking them to zoos and museums, helping with homework at the kitchen table. What struck me most was how happy he looked in these pictures. There was a lightness in his face that I realized had been missing during our visits in recent years. Not that he'd seemed unhappy when he was with me, but there was something different in these photos, a complete, unguarded joy. "He loved you all very much," I said, studying a picture of Michael with all three girls piled on top of him, everyone laughing. "He said he loved us as much as all the stars in the sky," Joy said, "and that even when we couldn't see him, he was always thinking about us." I felt tears threatening and blinked them back. This wasn't the time for my sadness. As the afternoon wore on, I noticed things that confirmed what Margaret had told me about Hope and Joy's condition. They tired more easily than Faith, and their movements were slightly less coordinated. When they played a game that involved jumping, Hope had to stop and rest after just a few minutes. Joy's hands shook slightly when she was concentrating on coloring, but what impressed me most was how naturally Faith took care of her sisters. She made sure Hope had a pillow behind her back. She helped Joy with the crayon that was giving her trouble, and she did it all without making a big deal of it. These children had learned to be a team in a way that was both beautiful and heartbreaking. Around 4 o'clock, Joy's energy seemed to flag completely. She curled up in my lap without asking, as if it was the most natural thing in the world. "Someone's getting tired," Margaret observed. "I'm not tired," Joy protested, but her eyes were drooping. "It's okay to be tired, sweetheart," I said, stroking her hair. It was fine and soft, just like Michael's had been when he was small. "Will you tell us a story?" Hope asked, snuggling closer on the couch. I looked at Margaret, who nodded. "What kind of story would you like?" "Tell us about when Daddy was little," Faith requested. And so I found myself sharing memories of Michael's childhood. I told them about how he used to collect bugs in jars, much to my horror. How he once tried to give our cat a bath and ended up soaked himself. How he learned to cook by standing on a chair next to me in the kitchen, insisting he was big enough to help. The girls listened with rapt attention, especially when I told them about Michael's determination to become a doctor after our neighbor, an elderly man named Mr. Patterson, had a heart attack. "Daddy said he wanted to help people feel better," Hope said drowsily. "He did help people," I assured her. "He was a wonderful doctor, and he was a wonderful father to you three." By the time I finished my stories, Joy had fallen asleep in my lap. Margaret approached quietly. "I should put her down for a nap," she whispered. "Can I carry her?" I asked softly. Margaret hesitated, then nodded. I lifted Joy carefully, surprised by how light she felt. She stirred slightly, but didn't wake as I followed Margaret down the hallway to a small bedroom. The room had 2 sets of bunk beds and was decorated with drawings and crafts the girls had made. Everything was neat and organized, but clearly well used. I laid Joy gently on one of the lower bunks, and Margaret covered her with a soft blue blanket. "She naps most afternoons," Margaret whispered as we left the room. "The condition makes her tire easily." When we returned to the living room, Faith and Hope were looking through more photo albums. "Can we show her the videos?" Faith asked Margaret. "Videos?" I asked. Margaret looked uncertain. "Michael used to record videos for them. Messages for when he couldn't visit, I'm not sure." "Please," Hope said. I want Grandma Marlene to see them. Margaret sighed and retrieved a tablet from a drawer. She scrolled through files before selecting one. Michael's face appeared on the screen and my breath caught. He was sitting in what looked like his apartment, smiling at the camera. "Hi, my beautiful girls," his recorded voice said. "I'm sorry I can't be with you today, but I wanted to tell you a story." For the next 10 minutes, I watched my son tell an elaborate fairy tale about 3 princess sisters who had to work together to save their kingdom. He used different voices for the characters and made silly faces that had Faith and Hope giggling, even though they'd clearly seen this video many times before. At the end of the story, Michael's expression became more serious. "Remember," he said, looking directly into the camera, "you 3 are the most important things in my whole world. I love you more than all the stars in the sky, and nothing will ever change that. Be good for Aunt Margaret, take care of each other, and remember that Daddy is always thinking about you." The video ended, and we sat in silence for a moment. I was crying, and I didn't care who saw. "He made lots of videos," Hope said quietly, "for when we missed him too much. He was a good daddy," Faith added, leaning against my shoulder. "Yes," I managed to say, "he was." Margaret sat down across from us, and for the first time since I'd met her, she looked less guarded. "This is hard for me," she admitted. "I've been their whole world for 4 years. The idea of sharing them, it scares me." "I don't want to take them away from you," I said honestly. "I can see how much you love them, and how much they love you. But Margaret, wouldn't it be easier if you had help?" She was quiet for a long moment. "Their next round of medical appointments is coming up. Hope needs to see the neurologist, and Joy's physical therapy evaluation is due. The insurance company is fighting some of the coverage. What if I handled that?" I offered. "What if we got them the best doctors, the best care, without worrying about insurance companies or costs?" "I can't let you just pay for everything," Margaret said. "That's not fair to you." "It's not about fair," I said. "It's about family. These girls are Michael's daughters. They're my granddaughters. Taking care of them is something I want to do." Faith had been listening to our conversation with the serious attention she seemed to give everything. "Aunt Margaret," she said quietly, "maybe it would be good to have help. You've been really tired lately." Margaret looked at Faith with surprise, and I realized these children were much more aware of the adult struggles than we probably wanted them to be. "We don't want you to be sad and tired all the time," Hope added. "Maybe Grandma Marlene could help make things easier." Looking at these 2 little girls, trying to take care of the woman who'd been taking care of them, I felt something shift in my chest. This wasn't just about me gaining granddaughters, or even about honoring Michael's memory. This was about a family that needed help, and I had the resources to provide it. "What if we started small?" I suggested. "What if I helped with the next round of appointments, just to see how it goes?" Margaret looked at Faith and Hope, who both nodded encouragingly. Then she looked at me with an expression that was part hope, part fear. "Okay," she said finally. "We can try that." As I prepared to leave that afternoon, Joy woke up from her nap and insisted on walking me to the door. All 3 girls hugged me goodbye, and Faith slipped a small piece of paper into my hand. "It's my phone number," she whispered, "in case you want to call us." I looked at the carefully written numbers in a 10-year-old's handwriting and felt my heart swell. "I would love to call you," I whispered back. As I drove home, I thought about everything I'd learned that day. These children were remarkable, not just in spite of their challenges, but because of how they'd learned to face them together. They were Michael's daughters in every way that mattered, and they'd been shaped by his love even though he could only be part of their lives in secret. But what struck me most was how naturally we'd all fallen into being together. It hadn't felt awkward or forced. It had felt like family. That night, I called the number Faith had given me. Margaret answered, and when I asked to speak to the girls, she handed the phone over without hesitation. "Grandma Marlene!" Joy's voice came through the speaker, full of excitement. "Did you get home okay?" "I did, sweetheart. Thank you for a wonderful afternoon." "Will you come see us again?" Hope asked. "As often as you'll have me," I promised. And I meant it. Whatever challenges lay ahead, Whatever medical appointments and insurance battles and difficult days awaited us, I was committed to being part of these girls' lives. They were my family, and family took care of each other. It was exactly what Michael would have wanted, even if he'd been too afraid to make it happen himself. 3 weeks into our new routine, I thought I was beginning to understand the reality of Hope and Joy's condition. I'd accompanied them to physical therapy appointments, watched them take their medications, and learned to recognize when they needed to rest. I'd even started researching their specific type of muscular dystrophy, trying to educate myself about what we were dealing with. But I wasn't prepared for what Dr. Chen told us during what I thought would be a routine checkup. "I need to discuss some test results," she said, settling behind her desk while Margaret, the girls, and I sat in the cramped examination room. Hope and Joy were coloring quietly in chairs beside us, while Faith sat protectively between her sisters. "The genetic testing we did last month has given us some important information," Dr. Chen continued, her voice carefully measured. "As we suspected, Hope and Joy do carry the genetic markers for the muscular condition. But there's something else." Margaret leaned forward, her face tense. "What kind of something else?" "The progression appears to be more aggressive than we initially thought. Without intervention, both girls may experience significant mobility issues within the next few years." The room seemed to go quiet, except for the soft scratching of crayons on paper. I felt like I couldn't breathe properly. "What kind of intervention?" I managed to ask. "There's an experimental treatment program at Johns Hopkins," Dr. Chen explained. "It's showing promising results for children with this specific genetic variant. But it's intensive. The girls would need to be there for several months, possibly longer." "Months?" Margaret's voice was barely a whisper. "I can't. I don't have the resources for that kind of—" "The program covers most medical costs," Dr. Chen interrupted gently. "But there would be living expenses, lost wages, the logistics of relocating temporarily." I looked at Hope and Joy, still focused on their coloring books, blissfully unaware that their futures were being discussed. Faith, however, had stopped coloring and was listening intently. "What happens if they don't get this treatment?" I asked, though I was afraid of the answer. "The condition will continue to progress. They'll likely need wheelchairs within 5 years, possibly sooner. Their life expectancy—" Dr. Chen hesitated. "It would be significantly shortened." Margaret made a small broken sound. I reached over and took her hand, feeling it tremble in mine. "But with the treatment?" I pressed. "The early results are very encouraging. Some children have shown marked improvement. Others have had their progression halted entirely. It's not a cure, but it could give them decades of additional mobility and independence." Faith had put down her crayon completely now and was staring at the doctor with those serious brown eyes. "Are you talking about Hope and Joy?" she asked quietly. Dr. Chen looked at Margaret, who nodded reluctantly. We'd agreed early on that the girls should be included in age-appropriate discussions about their health. "Yes, sweetheart. We're talking about a special program that might help them stay stronger for longer." "Would they have to go away?" Faith asked, and I heard the fear in her voice. "For a while, yes, but not alone. They would need someone with them." Faith looked at Margaret with an expression far too mature for a 10-year-old. "Aunt Margaret can't leave work for that long." "Faith," Margaret started, but Faith continued with the brutal honesty of a child who'd learned to face difficult realities. "And we can't afford it anyway. I heard you on the phone with the insurance company last week." Hope looked up from her coloring book, suddenly aware that something serious was happening. "Are Faith and I going to get sicker?" "Joy," Hope corrected automatically. "You meant you and Joy." "Right," Faith said, but I could see tears forming in her eyes. "Are Hope and Joy going to get sicker?" The room fell silent. Dr. Chen looked at Margaret, who was struggling to find words. Finally, I spoke. "Not if I have anything to say about it." Everyone turned to look at me. Margaret shook her head slightly, a warning not to make promises I couldn't keep. "Mrs. Patterson," Dr. Chen said carefully, "this is a significant commitment. The program typically lasts 6 to 8 months, sometimes longer. It's not just about financial resources." "I understand," I said, looking directly at Margaret, "but these are my granddaughters. If there's a treatment that could help them, then we're going to do it." "Marlene," Margaret said quietly, "you don't understand what you're saying. Months away from home, constant medical appointments, being responsible for them 24 hours a day while they're going through intensive treatment. Then come with us, I said simply. All of us. We'll rent a place near the hospital. I'll hire the best home care nurses, tutors for their schooling, whatever they need. Margaret stared at me. I can't let you do that. You're not letting me do anything, I said firmly. I'm choosing to do it. These girls are family. Hope had been listening to our conversation with growing concern. She slipped out of her chair and came to stand beside Margaret. Aunt Margaret, she said softly. Is this because of the money again? Margaret's face crumpled slightly. It's not just about money, sweetheart. It's about what's best for you and Joy. What's best for us is being together, Faith said, moving to stand with Hope. All of us together. Joy looked confused by the sudden seriousness but followed her sisters. Soon all three girls were clustered around Margaret's chair. We don't want you to be worried all the time, Joy said, patting Margaret's arm awkwardly. Maybe Grandma Marlene is right. Maybe it would be better if we all helped each other. I watched this exchange with a mixture of heartbreak and admiration. These children had learned to be caregivers at an age when they should only be worried about homework and playground politics. Dr. Chen, I said, what's the timeline for making this decision? The next enrollment period begins in 8 weeks. I'd need to submit the application within the next 2 weeks to be considered. I looked at Margaret, who was still surrounded by 3 worried little girls. What do you need to make this decision? Margaret was quiet for a long time. Finally, she looked up at me with tears in her eyes. I need to know that you understand what you're committing to. This isn't just about paying for treatment. This is about being responsible for 2 sick children for months, maybe years. This is about watching them struggle through painful procedures and setbacks, and still finding ways to keep their spirits up. And this is about Faith, she continued, looking at the 3rd triplet. She'll need support too, watching her sisters go through this. She'll need to feel like she matters just as much, even though she's not the one who's sick. I knelt down so I was at eye level with all 3 girls. Faith, Hope, Joy, I said seriously. If we do this, it's going to be hard sometimes. There will be days when Hope and Joy feel bad, and days when all of us feel scared or sad, but we'll face it together, as a family. Will we all stay together? Faith asked. Every single day, I promised. Even when it's hard? Hope asked, especially when it's hard. Joy, who'd been unusually quiet, suddenly stepped forward and hugged me tightly. I don't want to get sicker, she whispered against my shoulder. You're not going to get sicker, I said firmly, holding her close. We're going to fight this thing with everything we have. Later that evening, after we'd returned to Margaret's house and the girls were in bed, Margaret and I sat at her kitchen table with cups of tea neither of us was drinking. There's something else you need to know, Margaret said quietly. About why Michael kept them secret. I waited, sensing this was important. Sarah didn't just die from the genetic condition. She took her own life. The words hit me like a physical blow. What? She couldn't handle watching the girls start to show symptoms. She was terrified of what their future would look like, terrified they'd inherited her condition. One night she couldn't bear it anymore. I stared at Margaret, processing this information. The girls don't know. They think she died from complications of her illness, which is technically true. But Michael was devastated. He blamed himself for not seeing how bad her depression had gotten. That's why he didn't tell me about them, I said, understanding flooding through me. He was afraid I wouldn't be able to handle it either. Margaret nodded. He said you'd already lost your husband, that you didn't need to lose yourself worrying about sick grandchildren too. He was trying to protect everyone. I thought about my son, carrying this secret for years, trying to support these children and their mother while shielding me from what he saw as unbearable pain. He was wrong, I said finally, not about Sarah's pain. That was real and terrible, but he was wrong about me. I would have helped. I would have been there for all of them. Maybe, Margaret said, but you can't blame him for trying to protect you. That's what love looks like sometimes. Making hard choices to spare the people you care about. I sat in that small kitchen, thinking about Michael's secret videos for the girls, about the careful way he'd structured their lives to give them stability while keeping them separate from me, about how he'd worked extra shifts to pay for their medical care while never breathing a word about the financial strain. "Margaret," I said finally, "I want to do this treatment program. Not because I feel guilty about Michael's choices, but because these girls deserve every chance we can give them." She looked at me for a long moment. "It's going to change your life completely. You'll go from being a wealthy widow with no responsibilities to being a full-time caregiver for 3 children, 2 of whom have serious medical needs." "My life changed the moment I saw them at Michael's grave," I said. "Everything since then has just been figuring out how to make it work." Margaret smiled for the first time since we'd left the doctor's office. "Okay," she said, "let's do it. Let's give those girls the best shot we can." As I drove home that night, I thought about the conversation ahead of us with the girls, about the logistics of relocating our entire lives to Baltimore for months, about the challenges we'd face. But mostly I thought about Joy's small voice whispering, "I don't want to get sicker," and my own fierce response, "You're not going to get sicker." I'd made a promise to my granddaughters, and I intended to keep it. Whatever it took, however long it took, however much it cost, we were going to fight for their futures. It's what Michael would have wanted. It's what these brave little girls deserved. And it's what family does. We show up for each other, especially when the stakes are highest. The next morning, I called Dr. Chen's office and told them to submit the application for the treatment program. Then I called my financial advisor and told him I'd be making some significant changes to my spending priorities. For the first time since Michael's death, I felt like I had a purpose that mattered more than anything else in the world. 18 months later, I stood in the kitchen of our house in Baltimore, watching Faith help Joy with her physical therapy exercises, while Hope practiced piano in the living room. The sound of children's laughter mixed with music filled rooms that had been empty for too long, and I realized I couldn't remember what silence used to feel like. The treatment program had been everything Dr. Chen had warned us it would be. Intensive, exhausting, sometimes heartbreaking. There were days when Hope and Joy were too sick from the medications to do anything but sleep. Days when Faith felt left out because so much attention was focused on her sister's care. Days when Margaret and I were so tired we could barely think straight. But there were other days too. Days when Hope's muscle strength tests showed improvement. Days when Joy could walk farther than she had the week before. Days when all 3 girls laughed so hard at something ridiculous that we forgot to worry about test results and treatment schedules. "Grandma Marlene," Joy called from where she was doing her stretches, "when Faith and Hope turn 11 next month, can we have the party here?" "Of course, sweetheart," I said, still getting used to how naturally Grandma had become part of my identity. "What kind of party do you want?" "A pizza party," Faith said immediately, "with extra cheese and those little sausages." "Pepperoni," Hope corrected from the piano bench. "They're called pepperoni." I smiled at their constant corrections of each other, a habit that had become one of my favorite things about their sisterly dynamic. In the months we'd spent together, I'd learned that Faith was the organizer, Hope was the dreamer, and Joy was the peacemaker who kept them all connected. Margaret appeared in the doorway, home from her new job at the hospital's patient advocacy office. We'd found the position through Dr. Chen's connections, and it allowed Margaret to use her experience with medical bureaucracy to help other families navigate the system. More importantly, it gave her a sense of purpose beyond just caring for the girls. "How did therapy go today?" she asked, accepting the cup of coffee I handed her. "Joy walked 3 more steps than yesterday," Faith reported proudly. And Hope played that hard song all the way through without stopping. The progress had been slow but steady. Hope's condition had stabilized completely. Her muscle function was actually better now than it had been when we started. Joy's improvement was more gradual, but she was defying every pessimistic prediction the doctors had made about her mobility. More importantly, both girls had learned that their condition didn't define them. Hope was becoming an accomplished pianist, something she'd never had the energy to pursue before the treatment. Joy had discovered a talent for storytelling and was already talking about writing books when she grew up. "Speaking of the party," Margaret said, settling into her chair at our kitchen table, "I got a call from Dr. Chen today. She wants to include the girls in a case study about the treatment program." "What does that mean?" Faith asked, immediately alert to any conversation about her sister's medical care. It means Hope and Joy's progress has been so good that other doctors want to learn from it, I explained, to help other children who have the same condition. Would we have to do anything different? Hope asked, pausing her piano practice. Just some extra tests and interviews, Margaret said. Nothing painful or scary. They want to document how well you're both doing. The girls exchanged glances, that silent communication they'd perfected over the years. If it helps other kids, Joy said finally, we should do it. Definitely, Hope agreed. Right, Faith? Faith nodded seriously. We know how scary it was when we first found out about the treatment. If we can help other families not be so scared, we should. I watched this exchange with the same mixture of pride and heartbreak I felt almost daily. These children had developed a maturity and compassion that came from facing serious challenges together, but I sometimes wish they could just be carefree 10-year-olds. That evening, after the girls were in bed, Margaret and I sat on the front porch of our Baltimore house, something that had become our routine. The neighborhood was quiet, with the kind of peaceful evening sounds that reminded me why I'd fallen in love with this temporary home. I got a call from the real estate agent today, Margaret said quietly, about the house back home. We'd kept Margaret's house rented while we were in Baltimore, but the lease was ending soon. We needed to decide whether we were going back or making this move permanent. What are you thinking? I asked. Margaret was quiet for a moment, looking out at the street where some neighborhood kids were playing kickball in the fading light. The girls are settled here now. They have friends. They know their way around. Hope's piano teacher thinks she's talented enough for the conservatory program. Joy's enrolled in that creative writing class she loves. And Faith? I asked. Faith keeps asking if we're staying because she wants to try out for the school's debate team next year. Margaret smiled. She's got Michael's argumentative streak. It was true. Over the months we'd spent together, I'd seen more and more of my son in each of the girls. Faith had his determination and sense of responsibility. Hope had his quiet intensity and perfectionist tendencies. Joy had his optimism and his way of finding something good in every situation. What about you? I asked. What do you want? Margaret looked at me with surprise. What I want? When's the last time someone asked you that question? She was quiet for so long, I thought she wasn't going to answer. Finally, she said, I want the girls to be happy and healthy. I want them to have every opportunity they deserve. That's what you want for them, I said gently. What do you want for yourself? Margaret's eyes filled with tears. I want to not be afraid anymore, she whispered. For 4 years, I've gone to bed every night terrified that I'm not doing enough, that I'm failing them somehow. For the first time since Sarah died, I feel like maybe I'm not carrying this alone. I reached over and took her hand. You're not carrying it alone. You haven't been for months now. I know, she said. And that scares me too, because what if something happens to you? What if you decide this is too much? Those girls have already lost too many people. It was a conversation we danced around for months, but never addressed directly. Margaret's fear of abandonment was as real as the girls' medical needs. Margaret, I said firmly, I'm not going anywhere. These children are my family now. You're my family now. Whatever happens, we face it together. She squeezed my hand tightly. So we're staying in Baltimore? If that's what's best for the girls, then yes. We'll make it official. The next morning, I found myself in the unusual position of having 3 10-year-olds help me make a major life decision. We sat around the breakfast table with our pancakes and orange juice, and I laid out the choice before them. We can stay here in Baltimore permanently, I explained. Or we can move back to Aunt Margaret's house and visit here regularly for your medical checkups. What do you want to do, Grandma Marlene? Faith asked. I want to do whatever makes you 3 happiest and healthiest, I said honestly. But you had a whole life before us, Hope pointed out with that serious way she had of thinking about things. Don't you miss your old house and your friends? The question caught me off guard. Did I miss my old life? The big, empty house, the quiet days with no purpose beyond managing my investments and attending charity luncheons? You know what I miss? I said finally. I miss your daddy. I miss knowing I had family in the world. But I don't miss being alone. Joy had been unusually quiet during breakfast, and I noticed her watching me with those thoughtful eyes that reminded me so much of Michael. Grandma Marlene, she said softly, before you found us, were you lonely? The directness of the question took my breath away. Yes, sweetheart, I was very lonely. And now? I looked around the table at these three remarkable children who had transformed my life in every possible way. Now I wake up every morning excited to see what you three are going to do next. Now I have piano recitals to attend, and therapy sessions to drive to, and homework to help with. Now I have people who need me and people I need. So we make each other less lonely, Faith concluded with satisfaction. Exactly. Then we should definitely stay together, Joy said firmly. Families should stay together. All of us? Hope asked, looking at Margaret. All of us, Margaret confirmed. If Grandma Marlene is sure she wants three noisy girls permanently taking over her life. I can't think of anything I'd want more, I said, and meant it completely. Later that afternoon, while the girls were at their various activities, Hope at piano, Joy at her writing class, Faith at soccer practice, Margaret and I drove to a real estate office to look at houses for sale in the neighborhood. We'd outgrown our rental, and if we were staying permanently, we needed more space. Look at this one, Margaret said, pointing to a listing. 5 bedrooms, 2 offices, and a music room. I studied the photos of a large colonial house just a few blocks from where we were currently living. It had a big backyard for the girls to play in, a kitchen large enough for all of us to cook together, and best of all, it was within walking distance of the hospital where Hope and Joy would continue their follow-up care. It's perfect, I said. It's expensive, Margaret warned. It's family, I corrected. 6 months later, I stood in that same kitchen, but now it was truly ours. The girls had each decorated their own rooms. Margaret had turned one of the offices into a study space where she was taking night classes to become a certified patient advocate, and I had converted the music room into a library where we read together every evening. The walls were covered with artwork the girls had made, photos from our Baltimore adventures, and report cards that showed all 3 girls thriving in their new schools. Hope's piano was in the corner, where she practiced every day with the dedication Michael had shown to his medical studies. Joy's stories were pinned to a bulletin board, each one more creative than the last. Faith's debate team trophies sat on the mantelpiece next to photos of all of us together. But my favorite addition to the house was barely visible, a small framed photo on my nightstand showing Michael with the girls when they were younger. Margaret had found it among Sarah's things and given it to me for Christmas. In it, Michael is reading to all 3 girls, who are piled around him like puppies. Everyone is laughing at something, and the joy on my son's face is unmistakable. I understood now why he'd kept them secret. He hadn't been trying to hurt me or exclude me from their lives. He'd been trying to protect everyone he loved from pain he thought might be unbearable. He'd been wrong about what I could handle, but he'd been absolutely right about how much there was to love. That evening, as we sat around our dinner table arguing about whether pineapple belonged on pizza, Faith and I were firmly opposed, Hope and Joy were in favor, and Margaret claimed to be neutral but always ordered Hawaiian. I felt something I hadn't experienced since Gerald died: complete contentment. These 3 girls had given me more than granddaughters to love. They'd given me purpose, adventure, daily laughter, and the kind of family chaos I'd never known I was missing. Hope and Joy's medical needs had taught me that love wasn't just about the easy moments. It was about showing up for the hard ones, too. Faith's fierce protectiveness of her sisters had shown me what real strength looked like. And Margaret had become the daughter I'd never had. Someone who understood that family could be chosen as well as inherited. Grandma Marlene, Joy said, interrupting my thoughts. You're smiling funny. What kind of funny? I asked. Happy funny, Hope observed. Like when we surprised you with breakfast in bed on your birthday. I was just thinking about how much I love our family, I said simply. Even when we're being loud and arguing about pizza? Faith asked with a grin. Especially then, as we cleared the dishes together, I thought about Michael and wished he could see us now. His daughters were thriving, growing into remarkable young women who faced challenges with courage and treated each other with unwavering loyalty. They were getting the medical care they needed and the education they deserved. Most importantly, they were surrounded by people who loved them unconditionally. Maybe he had been trying to protect me from sadness, but what he couldn't have known was that loving these children, even with all the scary medical appointments and uncertain futures, had brought me more joy than I'd thought possible. I'd entered their lives as a grieving mother with nothing but money and loneliness. They'd transformed me into a grandmother with purpose, a family member with responsibilities that mattered, a woman with a future worth looking forward to. 3 little girls had whispered, "Bye, Daddy," at a graveside, and somehow that had led to all of us saying hello to a new kind of life together. It wasn't the life I'd planned, but it was infinitely better than the one I'd been living, and every single day I was grateful that love had found us when we needed it most. Now, I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below. And meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until here.